you guys could like also turn on your video so I feel like I'm talking to people as opposed to just lecturing into the void. And feel free to just raise your hand if you have any questions. Hi, so that we can, have a conversation as opposed to just me talking at you. Okay, so let's get right into it and chat about how to construct arguments well. So the basic structure that we're going to start with is really simple. I use an acronym called TAIL, and it's just thesis, analysis, impact, link. So the role of the thesis is just to flag to the adjudicator what you're going to prove with this argument. Analysis, obviously, on a signpost, be like 3 reasons why, for example, or like, let's walk through this process. Impact is just why this matters, and link is therefore, here's why we need to X or Y, obviously. So that's the like basic outline. I think that most people are aware that having a point is important. I think one issue that I've seen lots of debaters have is that their theses are not good, i.e. they're very, very long, for example, or they're messy, or they're just one word ideas. So for example, lots of debaters say, first, I'm going to talk about the economy, then I'm going to talk about politics, and I'm like, fine, but that's not really pointed about what you're actually trying to prove. So I like to try and do 2 things when I'm writing a thesis. I'll just explicitly be like, the first argument I'm going to prove to you is, and then insert statement X. So for example, if the motion is this house would ban or criminalize graffiti, my first argument on Gov might just be, graffiti is often accessed by underprivileged minorities, and therefore to ban graffiti is to restrict their ability to platform their voices. So that'd be a very, very long sentence, and often it would end up unclear. So in order to get a good thesis, I might just say, the first argument I'm going to show to you is that graffiti is important as a way for underprivileged people to express themselves and have a voice, and then move on. Like that'd be much easier than being like, here's my principal justification about all minorities, or about a really, really long rambling one. Another way to have a good thesis statement is to ask it as a question and then answer it yourselves. So for example, let's roll with, this house believes the Biden administration should de-escalate tensions with China, for example, by trying to resolve the trade war. Then my first argument on Gov might be about just why continuing tensions with China leads to economic ramifications that are really harmful. Then I might just ask, look, which side leads to more economic growth in this time of crisis? And then just us, 4 reasons why, for example. So like basically just trying to impress the importance of being clear and being very explicit to the judge what exactly you're trying to prove, as opposed to just gesturing to an area of the debate you're touching on. Cool. If there are no questions, let's chat about analysis. So yeah, analysis, fine. A problem that I see is that a lot of the times analysis is very chunky. So it's like a block of stuff and I have no idea how to sift through it. And it is also sometimes meandering, where the debater understands instinctively that what they're trying to prove is important, but these ideas are lost in a clump of other stuff. So there are 2 main ways in which I like to organize my analysis to make it clear, higher quality, and also to force myself to make my analysis better and deeper. The first way is just force myself to be like, here are 3 reasons why my thesis statement is true. And then think of 3 distinct reasons, go A, B, C, nice and clear. The other thing is that sometimes, especially in IR motions or motions about social movements, wherein both teams are working towards one goal, but have very different mechanisms for arriving at that goal, I find step-by-step analysis to be more effective. And that's just painting a very detailed picture of how you expect the solvency on your side of the house to work, and how you arrive at it. So for example, this house, as South Korea, would actively pursue nuclearization. For example, would be a motion in which the goal of both teams is to explain why North Korea chills out, and South Korea is better able to defend itself. So in this case, having reasons is inadequate, because I might say, look, this is effective in calming North Korea down because 1, there's now this disincentive because of mutually assured destruction, right? I am concerned about South Korea messing me up. Therefore, I, as North Korea, am also less likely to threaten South Korea. Fine, but you can anticipate that Op will just say, look, this won't happen because Kim Jong-un will obviously understand that when this happens, North Korea will totally lose leverage. Therefore, they will try to attack before that happens. And then, even if your reason is true, the other team is still rebutting it because your reason hasn't been terminalized enough. I.e., you've given some reasons why something might happen, but that hasn't been brought to the final conclusion you're trying to prove, that is to say, of North Korea agreeing to a treaty and denuclearizing. As such, having a step-by-step linkage of a series of events that happens and leading it towards that end would be more effective. So for example, I might start with, look, first reason why is this presents a much more active threat to Pyongyang. The reaction that Kim Jong-un will have is not to threaten or be belligerent towards South Korea, but rather to negotiate for these reasons, for example. So if you prove that each of these steps in your mechanism are correct and true, that should therefore lead you to the conclusion that you're going for. Does that make sense? I feel like that wasn't as clear as it could have been.
It does.
Okay, want another example or nah, we good?
I mean, I'm fine.
Another would be nice, I guess.
Okay. Any ideas as to which debate to use? Okay, I've thought of one. So the the debate that we get all the time is the one about whether minorities should pursue integration at the cost of unique cultural characteristics, right? Like this is a trade-off that happens all the time. So an argument I like to run from CG or from Gov is that, look, this isn't just important because it allows you to have like face less prejudice and discrimination. It's actually important because this allows us to retain young people within the cultural community. That's because forces to globalize and anglicize are all around us, and young people often move away organically from your own cultural heritage. And therefore, as that cultural organization, you ought to move along with them and leave some of the more radical elements of your culture in order to make sure that you can be related to by everyone within your community, and therefore remain relevant, remain the heart of the community, make sure that that young people feel a strong connection both to the companies that make them economically successful and these cultural institutions. So that's like just generally the argument. But you can plausibly understand that this isn't the kind of argument where giving some reasons is sufficient, because like, fine, you've given some reasons why some people might act in this way, but people are very, very diverse. So others might act in a different way, for example, or the reasons you give might be true, but Ob can just come with alternative reasons that are more powerful to explain why young people don't behave in this way, for example. Therefore, having a step-by-step set of claims about how, look, first thing I want to establish is that young people are under a lot of pressure. Here's why. Why, therefore, is it effective and necessary for us to integrate into a mainstream culture in order to become relatable and pertinent to them? 3 reasons why. Given this, why is it that young people are going to feel a greater sense of connection towards their culture and to the people around them? Finally, why does this benefit young people so much? And why do we value that over everything else in this debate? And that we kind of transition into impacting on weighing too. I hope that's clear. It takes some practice, but I think that the easiest way for you to figure out what the necessary steps to prove are just thinking about 2 things. One, what's the hardest step to prove? I.e., when you're writing your argument out, where's the jump between the stuff you have and the end impact you're claiming, which often is greater than what your analysis is actually sufficient to prove? And 2, what can you imagine the responses you'll get from the other side are? So just some preemption, work that into your argument as opposed to prepare it for rebuttal. And then generally you have a pretty solid argument with a lot of the prerequisite steps. Cool, so that's analysis. Reasons is the easiest, especially for arguments that don't have such a high burden of proof that are uncontroversial. Sometimes if it's a mechanism debate wherein all teams are trying to prove that you benefit a similar group in very different ways, then the step-by-step linkage chain is more appropriate. Okay, so that's analysis. Now I don't have slides for impacting and for weighing and for linking because I'm not comfortable with that. Impacting is just, I think two things are important to keep in mind. One, be explicit about the impact. So even if you think it's really, really marginal, it's still important to be like, look, it's important for us to maintain these cultural institutions because these people are members of a minority. They often look different to the people around them. They feel vulnerable. They find it hard to fit into greater society. Therefore, it's extremely important for them to have an in-group where they feel like they belong over everyone else. In a world without this, people in like young people of diaspora culture. So for example, recent African Americans to Europe, for example, or brown or Asian people in America often feel isolated, alone, inferior. Like that just kind of explicit impacting is good. And the second main thing is just illustrate. So I understand that like fluff is fluff and it's pointless, but strategic employment of fluff is often good. So a bit of picture painting as to what this average person looks like, what they're going through, toss in a few adjectives, slow down a bit so that stylistically this stands out to the judge. All of this will make it seem like you have a really big impact that needs to be taken into consideration. Finally, linkages. Honestly, I don't do linkages all the time, and that's because often I'll just do weighing. But this is a personal weakness of mine that I'm trying to overcome. So it's important after you prove an argument that you just sum up for the judge. So what have I proven to you so far that this is true? And the reason for this isn't because like this is like good debating in society, but it's because judges don't pay that much attention. They're not going to flow every single word you say. Sometimes, obviously some judges are wonderful, but it's still useful for you to say this line at the end of the argument so the judge knows exactly what to write down for you. This is especially true if you're a novice or an ESL speaker, because judges will often instinctively just want to have a call and then try to dismiss the teams that they think are less likely to win, or who will get less mad at them if they give them the 4. Therefore, just being really clear about here's the thing that you must credit us with will force them to explicitly compare this contribution to that of other teams. So that's the main value of concluding and having that linking statement at the end. Cool. So that's the basics. That's what you need to do to give a good 76, 77 speech. Here's how you go further and make your every argument you produce even stronger. I just add 2 additional steps to my tale structure, and that's framing after my thesis and before my analysis, and weighing after my impacting. So what's framing? Framing is a confusing thing because so many people like have different words for it, and it's pretty vague. What I mean by framing in this particular context is just explaining what the role this argument is playing in this round, why it's important before it even starts. So positioning your claim within the debate to explain its relevance. Let me give you an example. Okay, so I'm gonna use a weaker argument to explain how framing can make a difference. So again, remember that this has to criminalize graffiti art debate. An argument you might run is that, look, this is principally wrong for the government to ban because it's not causing any third-party harm. Therefore, it's an overreach of government oversight, right? So like, I would instinctively be like, this is a BS argument, just because op can be like, sure, but like, here are some harms, and therefore your argument falls, right? It's a purely defensive argument, and it's quite weak, and it's often hard to impact out a framing argument. In this case, I would run some stuff about how, look, just like the genetic stuff as to why graffiti doesn't cause harm, about if it's on private property, can easily be erased, about what the spots that graffiti happens to be on usually are. That is to say, like 90% of the time, it's going to be on bridges. It's going to be on like older walls in the shadier parts of the city, for example. It's going to be artwork if it's a nicer part because that's where it's allowed to stay. Artists don't want to waste their effort. They're not going to waste time painting up some rich person's like vans, for example. Like all of that stuff implies that the value of graffiti is artistic, sends a message, isn't going to be like meaningfully harmful to in any way, even if it's mildly inconvenient to some rich folks. We don't care. Okay, so that's the analysis. But here's the framing of the argument that makes it slightly better. I would just give a few parallels for things we do that the state does not forbid. So for example, busking is allowed, even though it invades public space, arguably to a far greater extent than graffiti does. Because I can look away from graffiti, I can't stop myself from hearing it. Because if I, in a reasonably rich neighborhood, I'm living in my house, I can still hear buskers or street performers outside, right? I can I can look away, I can't stop listening, like all of that kind of stuff. The reason for this is because we understand that everything is about a trade-off of rights, right? It's about restricting autonomy in order to preserve rights. In the vast majority of instances, unless it's a clear violation of rights, the state aims to maximize autonomy to the greatest extent. And that's because they understand that every person needs the ability to do whatever they want in order to feel happy, in order to fulfill their goals, in order to just feel like an agent as a human being, as opposed to just living a strictly controlled life. When the state overreaches, we generally tip over into authoritarianism, because that's the point at which you also allow the state to take other actions in the public interest, even though that might not benefit every single human being, for example, because the incentive of the state is to make sure that everything is stable and that they themselves can enter power. So that's like unnecessarily long, but I guess the point I'm trying to prove is that the framing of this argument is that they have to defend the active erasure of certain people's autonomy and ability to express themselves, and that this is never the state's role to do so. So it forces a higher burden upon them. It makes your defensive argument about how there's no real harm into an offensive argument about how they have to defend this breach of autonomy, for example. So that's what framing should look like. Obviously, it can also be far more chill. Like, for example, like if it's about like, this house believes that the USA should or should not withdraw from Afghanistan, and you have one argument about destabilization or about a power vacuum, then the frame would just simply be, look, we think that this argument is the most important argument in the round, just because the counterfactual is the absolute worst case scenario where all of these harms happen. Therefore, even if OP has some benefit standing, we think that the risk of this harm is such that you should disregard that and prioritize preventing this harm, for example. Yeah, just framing, like, work on it. It is sometimes useful, sometimes not. Personally, I don't find it that useful well, I don't do PM or LO. I usually speak deputy, but I tend not to frame for the first speaker arguments, because they should intuitively be obvious. Where I find framing the most useful is in your extension speech, in member, wherein you have an argument that's slightly out of left field and might be derivative, but when you insert this framing to explain why it's important or why it's distinct, just super useful for making your extension more relevant and to boost those speaks a little bit. Any questions about framing?
Yeah, I had a question.
Mm-hmm.
You have talked about some motions. I'd like to go with a specific if you have any uncomfortable religious motion, like banning religious advocacy in public places or anything like that, when you're feeling really uncomfortable to go up with some kind of arguments when you're religious, because we know that many debaters can be religious. So how can you frame that kind of argument when you're uncomfortable, firstly, and secondly, you're unsure if it's gonna be if it's gonna have greater impact on society?
I think two things. The first is just that you should not force yourself to debate a motion that you feel uncomfortable debating. The equity policy of this tournament is such that you should be able to opt out of a round without it damaging your speaks average or your chances to break. If that's the case, just let the equity team know. and we'll arrange a swing for that room, for example. And obviously, like as the CAP, we've also endeavored not to set anything that's triggering or that's offensive. The second main thing is if you're in that round, framing isn't really relevant to if you feel uncomfortable debating a motion, because even with or without the framing, running analysis that goes against your personal beliefs or which you find offensive is still going to make you uncomfortable. What I would advise in such a round is honestly just to go for another impact. You might not take the 1 or the 2 in such a round, but if you have a contribution that's political, for example, or it's about the economy, or it's a feminist extension, or it's about socioeconomic inequality, so blah, blah, blah. Like even if it's not right on the dot about what the heart of the motion is, if you can present a reasonable set of analysis as to why this other impact that you're comfortable with proving is, then that's fine. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and if I may like share my personal experience, like I tend to, if I have this kind of motion, I tend to go with like the political impact, like the politicians using this religion as a means of power to rally people for their own agenda. So I like to go for that kind of social impact. Is it really relevant to the debate or like impactful?
It is relevant. Especially if, like, the important thing is just to, if you know that your analysis isn't what the CAs are expecting when they set this motion, just focus in on A, the analysis, and 2, the impact. So just be very, very clear about how the sequence of events unfolds such that you get to your harm and then impact that harm. Even if it's like not the core issue of the debate, if you prove it well and impact it and weigh it against the harms everyone else has given, it's enough for you to win. I think the wildest thing I've done is can't really remember. I think I once gave an extension about the LGBTQ plus community in a debate about the environment for some reason. This was in my youth when I thought it was fun to just run wild extensions. But I was also lucky to be in a room which was not so great because this was like a high school tournament. And we were still able to take the 1 because we weighed it well enough. So yeah, just rebut everyone else, you'll be fine.
Thank you. It
of course.
Answers the question.
Okay, so that concludes the first half of this session, where you learn how to construct an argument well. Now we'll move on to the second and more difficult part of the workshop, which is about nuance. So first, what is nuance? So in my experience, nuance is about kind of acknowledging that debate doesn't always mirror the real world. I'm gonna take a hot second and stop screen sharing so that I can bring my speaking notes up and look at both at the same time. Okay, great. Share screen. Okay, can you guys see the screen clearly?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Cool. So first question is just what is nuance? So in my mind, nuance is understanding that debate land often differs a lot from the real world. So we'll often have to make sweeping generalizations about people that are totally unfair or that are just unconvincing. Nuance is about pointing out the distinctions that can exist within groups of people or within circumstances. And it is just useful to do in order to make your arguments more sophisticated. So practically, ways in which you can do this is by looking at different stakeholders, recognizing their different motivations, sounding credible as you're arguing harms and benefits, and often it creates the most memorable moments in a debate. Nuance matters because when you don't have nuance, it's just super easy for the other team to be like, proposition believes that all women are like this, haha, that's untrue, and then get away with rebutting your claims very, very easily. Whereas when you have nuance, it's far more compelling to the judge, because they reasonably believe that this is the point you're making could genuinely happen in the real world, and you don't have any moments when they're like, yeah, I don't really buy that. Okay, so 4 reasons in which nuance is useful. 1, it means that judges credit arguments more, as I said. 2, more importantly, it helps you break deadlocks. So this is useful in bottom half. We're in top half, we'll have this vigorous clash about whether X is true or Y is true. And it'll often be quite black and white, where Gov is trying to prove it's 100% this, and Op is trying to prove 100% that. Let me find an example, so this is less vague. Let's get back to the US-China kind of debate about whether Biden should de-escalate tensions with China. So Gov might argue, yes, because this is a world wherein you'll get along well, and this will help both economies grow. And Op will say, no, that's not true. China will be super abusive and do huge amounts of dumping, and that's really, really bad. So with some nuance, you and CG can come in and say, look, we just think that the upper house debate has been extremely unnuanced. It's probably true that the real world is somewhere in between, where we concede that China may have engaged in some predatory behavior. And we also agree with OG that there's definitely going to be a lot of economic growth. Here's why, though. De-escalating tensions is the only way in which the Biden administration can check the predatory behavior that China conducts, and therefore mitigate the harms that Op is so concerned about. So finding that middle ground, finding that gray area is a way to break ties that are happening in top half. 3, it helps with case building and uniqueness. In 2 ways. 1, nuance is just useful for focusing on a specific group and therefore being distinct from top half if you're struggling with extensions. But 2, nuance is important for forming a good case, because one thing that happens a lot with novice debaters is that cases are generic. So for example, you'll get the same black market argument a billion times, and you'll get the same refutation about how, but at least then fewer people are consuming the product. And I'm like, okay. So from Gov, if you run black market arguments, therefore, having that uniqueness and explaining why the specific circumstances surrounding this particular market are such that a black market is way harder to crack down on than usual, or the harms are impossible to mitigate. So that specificity is useful. Cool. So I hope I have successfully pitched nuance. Now I'm just gonna talk you guys through 4 drills that I either learned or made up that help with developing nuance. Okay, so these are quite strange. The first thing is the 10-80-10 drill. And I have, I think, a piece of paper here. Yeah. So can you guys see my camera? So when I'm teaching classes, like this is the diagram that I always use when I'm demonstrating this drill, because this drill is basically to explain that in all circumstances, there will be outliers. So for example, in a debate about whether or not you should allow criminals to undergo drug testing in exchange for shorter sentences, plausibly, there's an extreme 10% wherein these criminals have an extreme reaction and are really severely medically injured. And therefore, even if their sentences are cut down, they might be chronically ill or they even pass away. On the other hand, there is another positive 10% wherein these criminals contribute something to the world because they test that this medicine is safe, they have their sentences significantly cut down, they're released into the real world, they're able to reunite with their families, they're able to make like a great life for themselves. So those are the extreme cases. Acknowledging that and pointing it out is useful for 2 reasons. The first is that this allows you to characterize what the 80%, i.e. the majority of cases, is like. Wherein plausibly you get a shorter sentence, but you also suffer some health impacts even though they're not devastating. Yes, you get released slightly earlier, but the road to rehabilitation is probably not completely smooth, i.e. you might still plausibly face issues with re-employment, for example, or even recidivism. Given that 80%, that worst case scenario, this helps you make your argumentation better because you're not dependent on that extreme example to prove harm or benefit. Does that make sense? Because I explain why this is not just good for the 10% of people who get released early and have great lives, but why the 80% who might suffer to some extent are still better off because comparatively, like, this is more important. But the other reason it's important is because it also makes you aware when the harm you're delivering is an extreme. So on op, for example, I might still run the argument that there's this severe risk of damage of the worst case scenario, right? And then this just allows you to sound more plausible because your claim isn't that prisoners start dropping dead left and right, and we don't like that, but we say, look, the reason why medical trials are unpopular is because often they do have like bad reactions. Because even though we do animal testing, the biology of a rabbit is very different from the biology of a human being, and there are unexpected and terrible consequences, i.e. the thalidomide disaster, for example. In those cases, we can reasonably expect there will be some people who will be really, really hurt or even killed by these experiments, especially since they're prisoners, especially since resources will be scarce, and because like you care less about them logically than the people from the street who sign up for this for a bit of extra cash. Given all of this, why is this possibility of harm is so severe that we should still not permit this to happen? And then just be like coercion or irrational behavior or just positivity bias means that people will sign up for this, not really understanding the risk, blah, blah. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So that's the 10-80-10 drill. It's about debating in the middle ground or about framing the importance of the edge cases. But also, I literally just realized while I was explaining weighing that I forgot to actually go through weighing with you guys. I finished framing and then I was like, moving on. Okay, weighing is important. It's really important. So I'll just do it now. So I think that there are two main steps when it comes to weighing. The first is to know what you're weighing against. So the point of weighing is not just to say, here's why it's super, super important, but like a scale to understand what the other team's biggest harm is and to find a way to explain why your harm is more significant than theirs. So the first part to weighing effectively is preempting and understanding what the other team's case is going to be and what their best case scenario is. This is relevant when you're OG, but it's also relevant if you're any other team because you want to weigh against the best case scenario of the other team's case, not what they're actually running. Because you never know when you get a whip extension, for example, or when a closing half is significantly better than a top half team. The second main thing when it comes to weighing, given that you already like can predict to some extent what their biggest harm is being very, very explicit in using your weighing mechanisms and taglining them. Again, because that's what the judge is going to refer back to when they're comparing your arguments against each other. If you have that weighing mechanism and the other team doesn't, you automatically win. Here's a few weighing mechanisms that I often use. One, number of people, which I'm sure you guys have all heard of. Like, if this affects everyone, then this is a greater amount of suffering, and therefore we should care about them more. Another way to explain why number of people is the correct weighing mechanism is just by saying, look, it's the government's responsibility to look after the many, not to sacrifice the interests of the many in order to protect a very, very select few. For example, even though it'd be a really, really great thing if all public textbooks were typed both in whatever language you use and Braille, we understand that it's too resource intensive and the cost placed upon the general public is such that even though the severity of the benefit to this small subset of the population is so great, the government still doesn't do this. And you'll notice that within that weighing, I'm also implicitly weighing against preempting their weighing mechanism, which is that we have a benefit that applies to a greater number of people, and that should be credited even if the other team proves a more severe benefit where you have a greater magnitude, right? Two, what's your question?
Um, I'm really confused about the like differences between weighing and comparative, because it does seem like both are like same or like in the same wavelength.
So I think that the main difference is where in the argument it happens. For me, comparative happens in the analysis stage, because what you're doing is you're being like, here's what happens on our side. On the other hand, let me paint you a picture of what happens on their side. So it's very analysis based, and it's on putting two worlds side by side. Weighing is also comparing in a way, but it's less presenting to the judge literally what the comparative is, and more, given that we've already established the comparative, here's why you should credit ours more. The other main difference is that you're a lot more charitable when you're weighing than in your analysis. In your analysis, you're doing your best to paint their comparative as really, really dire and terrible, right? But in weighing, it's important not just to weigh against that atrocious comparative you've created, but you're assuming that the other team isn't useless and that they are successfully proving that their comparative isn't terrible. Given that best case form of the comparative, here's why you should still credit our benefits over theirs. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Okay, two, there's a thing of severity. And again, like the magnitude of the harm. And again, you can find other parallels to explain why magnitude of harm is the most important metric in the round. So stuff about how like, yeah, intuitively, even if I had to go without my laptop for like a month and 6 other people also had to do this, I would still probably be willing to do this in order to keep someone from being evicted from their home, for example, or in a more extreme scenario, if I needed to sell my laptop because I was the only person who would be able to save someone's life. This is a weird example, but that's because I didn't prepare any parallels. I'm sure that like when you're in a round, there are going to be intuitive examples that you can draw for when oftentimes we need to sacrifice the greater good in order to protect the most vulnerable people who are suffering the greatest degree of harm. There's also stuff like, who does the government has the greatest obligation to? Who's the most vulnerable actor in this debate because they have the least ability to help themselves? Which harm is irreversible, and why should we care about that more? Long-term harms, probability, like we should always prevent something that we are sure that's going to happen, as opposed to crediting a risk, for example, for these reasons, like all of that kind of stuff. So there's a huge number of different weighing mechanisms. I have given you some examples, but I'm sure you guys can think of them yourselves. The point, though, is just to be very, very explicit that you're doing this weighing. You can even just say, the weighing mechanism we're giving for this, i.e. the reason we think our harm is more important than that which OP is giving you is this. And the second main thing to remember is just to be charitable in your weighing, even if you're not charitable in your analysis. And that reason is because if your weighing is weighing against the worst case scenario of another team, the judge will just be like, yeah, they weighed their stuff, but they really weren't fair to the other team's impacts. So like, I still believe the other team when they say that their impacts are a really big deal, just because Gov were uncharitable when dealing with them, for example. So yeah, be charitable when you're weighing and be preemptive. Back to nuance. Are there any questions though? Okay, sweet. Cool. So we've chatted about the 10-80-10 drill. It's less of a drill and more just a way of thinking that will help you be reasonable in rounds. The second thing I'm going to talk about, the EMB drill, though, is really a drill. And EMB is an acronym that stands for easy, medium, oh, crap, I wrote it wrong. It's actually EMD. I was thinking easy, medium, bad when I was writing this, but the acronym is actually EMD, and the D stands for difficult. So it's about thinking of three, like, because obviously all contexts exist along a spectrum, right? It's about picking one out that's on your best case scenario, one that's on their best case scenario, and one in the middle ground, and explain why your benefits accrue in each of these scenarios. So when is this drill really useful? It's useful in two circumstances. One is in a context-heavy debate, where Gov and Op will each try to win the debate on their best case scenario and refuse to cross the floor. and it'll be really frustrating for the judge because it'll just be parallel. And it's also useful too when you're desperate for mechanisms and can not think of more than 2 layers of analysis. This will also just help you generate more mechanisms. Cool. Let's actually run through this. The motion I'm going to set as an example for this case is this has to make poverty an absolute defense for crimes of acquisition. Do you need any clarifications on what that means? Because there are lots of like unnecessarily fancy words.
Could you repeat it?
Okay, no, you're not debating it. I just want you guys to tell me what the easiest context for gov is, what the median context for gov is, and what the most difficult context for gov is.
You mind repeating the motion once? I was not able to hear.
Yeah, I'll actually type it into the Zoom chat. Chat. There. So basically, we would forgive you for stealing if you are very, very poor and not prosecute you.
I think easy for Gov is saying that, oh, these people's lives suck so much and they have like absolute zero ability to ever become economically like sustainable in order to sustain life, because of which they either die or they steal.
Right, yeah.
I think that's easy. I think in terms of what might be very hard for government is like people who don't necessarily like can live even outside of stealing, but they're still poor and they want attractive things. So instead of stealing for food, they steal for things like a Gucci shirt or like expensive or luxury items.
Yeah, so the easiest context, as you said, I'm a starving mother, my child has pneumonia, I stole a loaf of bread. Like no judge is going to be like, yeah, that's wrong. The hardest context is going to be, as you said, stealing a Gucci shirt. The median context is probably stealing money, because it's not like a direct thing that you might necessarily need, but you can still see how it would really do a lot to improve your quality of life and how you have no other alternatives to finding it, right? For example, if you're late on rent. So you can find reasons to prove that, that in each of these 3 cases, that poverty is still absolute defense. Why? Let's start the easiest context. Why is it that if I'm a starving parent and I steal bread, then the state ought to forgive me?
Because it's technically the state's responsibility to take care of you in that sense.
Yeah, great. That's
and
good.
another thing is that the government who is supposed to take care of you is a criminal, is like aiding the criminals, or like is responsible itself for making you a criminal in the first place.
Interesting. I would actually say that for later, because I'm not sure that this is tied directly to the context of being extremely poor and having to steal bread. I would actually save that mechanism for the difficult context, when you can't use some of the more direct reasonings. I'll show you why later. But like for now, for the easiest context we have, look, you're unable to meet your basic needs. It is the state's fault because the state should be able to guarantee this baseline for every single human being. Given that, it's justified for you to steal. Other more basic stuff would just be like, this is a matter of literally self-defense, right? Because I cannot fucking buy food. I am going to starve. It's justified for me to hurt others in order to prevent myself from suffering extreme harm. In the same way that it's fine for me to punch someone in the face if I think that I'm likely to be like assaulted, for example. Cool. So now for the medium context, why is it still justified for me as someone who's impoverished to steal money?
I think it becomes what for the hard context, right? For the medium.
This is the medium context about stealing money. Luxury goods, the hard context.
I think in terms of the medium context, you talk about it, instead of being like state has to ensure that you have basic requirement, you can argue about state's failure to ensuring that you have the ability to meet rent, etc. in the first place. So
And
Yeah,
arguments
that's really
were-
good.
and I can like say that when you're working for a company and the company fires you, you don't really have money to feed your family, so you just like go for robbery or snatching people's money. So not going to the like state level, but going to the corporation level as well.
Yeah,
Is
both
it
of these
relevant?
work. Yeah, both of these work. So I could say, look, I've been unemployed. I have no other option. Therefore, it's justified because like having no other choice is an important criteria when proving justification. I also
think-
buy the, yeah, go.
I think maybe you could argue that a majority of the people who are stuck in medium context often happens in capitalistic societies, to the point where like normal welfare states, etc., do like support you enough for you to be have the ability here. I think then you
Yeah.
can prove that these people are already getting fucked over by
Yeah.
society structures and failures that exist or inherent flaws within the structures. You again give them like a double jeopardy by ensuring that even if they're like late once or twice, you're still discriminating against them and throwing them out on the street. Compared to like rich people in these societies, if they miss like their loan interest by 1 month, nothing happens to them on a comparative
True.
as compared to poor people.
Yeah, that's really, really good. Because you're also bringing the idea about disproportionate levels of punishing and the law applying additionally hard to those who are very, very poor, at the point at which you're not making an exception for poor people. You're actually leveling the playing field. That's really smart. Okay, finally, on the most difficult context, I'm going to actually apply the idea we got earlier about how, look, it's the reason why it's unjustified for the state to lock you up for stealing even a luxury item is because your life of crime is partially the state's own fault. I think there's some work to put in here because there's an obvious up response that no, if you choose to steal luxury goods when you don't need it, this is probably because you're a bad person, not the state's fault. So you probably want to frame, look, when is someone going to steal luxury goods when they don't need it? In the vast majority of instances, no one does this for fun because there's a likelihood that you'll get caught, for example, or just because you feel a sense of guilt at taking something away from the vendor. For those reasons, often those who take part in robbery for more flashy, visible goods, for example, jewelry or brand name clothing, likely to be people within organized crime or who have acquaintances or friends who also have a similar lifestyle. And therefore, what you're trying to do is to fit in, for example, prove yourself, or you see it as a norm because this is what everyone around you is also doing. In these instances, the state is definitely at fault because you reach out towards these institutions for support at the point at which you feel isolated from the state, at the point at which you feel like normal unemployment is not an option for you, at the point at which you actually even feel unsafe because the state isn't doing enough to crack down on these criminal networks. Given that, even habitual crime that is unnecessary for theft is still, to a large extent, the state's responsibility. And therefore, you ought not be punished. For sure, you ought to be rehabilitated. You ought to be made to go to mandatory sessions where you have therapy, where the state hooks you up with a new job, for example, but you shouldn't be put in prison. So using the EMD drill, we've looked at a spectrum of different instances, and we've proved why for each of these cases, the state, like, it's unjustified to punish these people. It's useful for having a broad structure, a broad spectrum of people, and therefore not just debating the worst case scenario, the best case scenario. And you also beat their best case round. But it's also great because it just means you have three completely unique and separate reasons to prove your overall statement, as opposed to just defending the idea about how, look, I'm poor, I have no other choice. So yeah, that's an example of the EMD drill. Any questions?
I'd like to add something like not going for a big state, like it's a really big responsibility for like criminalize the state. Rather going for the law itself, that the law criminalizes people based on their race, or like if they're rich people, they have leeway to get away. But if you're poor, you'll get punished severely. So if I take a specific approach rather than a very big approach, which approach will be credited much?
I actually think that the broader approach is more useful as opposed to talking about specific subgroups, just because the other team can be like, look, maybe this is true for this particular subset, but like we agree that there's racial injustice in many countries, for example. This debate is not about that. This debate is about class. So just being broad in general and making sure logic applies to everyone is a safer bet than only focusing your argument on one group of people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Then let's chat about the spider drill. Spider drill is just purely a drill. I very rarely use it in an actual debate, but it's super useful for creating skills. So the spider drill, I call a spider drill because back before COVID, when I did preps in person, I would do it on a whiteboard, and the many lines spreading out from the center would end up looking like a big spider. So the way the spider works is that you have one generic theme at the top, that's the thesis that you're trying to prove. And then the way in which you make it nuanced is you constantly change up actors, like specific groups of people within that group, and then you explain how they interact differently with the argument. So for example, if you have the argument that LGBT people benefit from legal recognition, you would then break down the larger subset of LGBTQ plus people down into gay couples, for example, transgender people, bisexual people, like different sets of people, and then come up with different mechanisms explaining why legal recognition can benefit all of these people in completely different ways. Does that make sense? Like, do you guys understand what a spider drill is? Cool. So I'm gonna give you guys the groups. Here are some mechanisms. I should not have put the mechanisms on this page. What I'm gonna ask you to do is to roll with one of these groups and then explain why legal recognition benefits them specifically with a new mech for each group.
Cool. So I think firstly, under the scope of LGBTQ, you could talk about how like discourse about like transsexual identity, etc., is still underrepresented within the liberal context of the movement in and of itself. So you can talk about while people like gay marriages, etc., like especially like you would use context like India, right? In India, like finally being in a gay relationship isn't illegal anymore, but there aren't as many rights given to trans people, etc. So the point at which you sort of give each and every one of them legal protection, it helps people who are underrepresented even in progressive contexts, which means that over time, while other subsects of the LGBTQ movement are improving, trans community is still lagging behind. This gives them that necessary impetus to improve in the first place.
Nice. More representation for trans people benefit from legal recognition because that gives them valuable exposure, whereas in the status quo, very few people know about them, and therefore they're still not accepted. They often face disproportionate barriers. Fine. Was someone else want to give it a shot before I go? Okay, no issues. I can go. So that's what you gave just now. Perfectly great mech. When I was thinking, I went slightly more specific. So because each of these are really, really like specific, right? So one, LGBT people benefit from legal recognition. There are 3 reasons why this is true, focusing on 3 different groups within the community. One is chat about cis-passing trans people, i.e. trans people who identify differently from the sex they were assigned at birth and whose appearances have changed sufficiently for them to be recognized as such in public. The reason why legal recognition is so important is because that's the point at which the names and the sexes on their IDs can finally change to match their gender identity as opposed to the assigned sex. The reason why this shift in documentation is so important is because when you rock up at an office and I look like a girl, but I'm actually, my passport says that I'm a dude, that is a red flag to my employers and makes getting equal and respected employment much more difficult. I get intrusive questions in my life, blah, 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 blah. Okay. 2, why is it so important for non-passing trans people to have legal recognition as well? because that's the point at which they're also able to do things because when I am recognized and accepted by my gender as opposed to my sex, this is the point at which I'm able to use whatever facilities I would like. So that's the entire controversy about bathroom laws, where there's the idea that like trans people are only trans because they're predators, and it's men who are going into female bathrooms in order to be perverts. When you get legal recognition, I have the right to use the facility that assigns my gender, that matches my gender, in every single context. And it's really important for me because otherwise I go through a traumatic dysphoric experience every time I have to go to the bathroom, or I get weird looks, I get side eyes, I even get chased out when I try to use the room that matches my sex. Finally, homosexual people, when I have legal recognition, I can literally get married, for example, but it's also far, far easier for me to do things, just sue on the basis of discrimination within the workplace or sue for hate speech, at the point at which the law recognizes that I am an identity group that exists, which is valid and which is vulnerable and underrepresented. So in all of these three ways, some of the most important obstacles in the way of these specific identity groups can be resolved by legal recognition. Really important. And this really forces the other team to respond. But it also just helps you and this was the analysis I wrote out earlier. You can take a screenshot, whatever. The point is, though, that it helps you think of not only more nuanced identity groups, but it also helps you think of more nuanced mechanisms for each of these sets of people. And hopefully means your arguments can be richer, as opposed to just generically being like, legal recognition is good because I can have more legal defense, which is the unnuanced version of this argument that is just really unclear to the judge why I should care, right? Like having the very, very tangible impact of, here's why documentation is key, here's why being able to use the right bathroom is intrinsic to not that kind of thing. Cool. Any questions about the spider drill? If not, then let's just finally chat about arrowhead arguments. Unlike the spider drill, I tend to use the arrowhead argument far more in my actual speeches than in order to develop my skills. So the arrowhead argument, I use this card to demonstrate. So the reason for this is because the arrowhead argument is about applying a generic argument to a very specific context and explaining how that nuanced context exacerbates and amplifies the existing harms I'm trying to prove. So let's take the argument, this house would legalize prostitution. My first argument would be, look, this is important because legalizing prostitution makes it easier to regulate and therefore safer. And then I'd give a set of generic arguments as to why, when you have legalization that allows for better state oversight. For example, you can have state-managed vendors when it comes to drugs. Let me just mute you. But also just stuff like, this means that you don't force people to go underground in order to seek goods out. This means that everything is safer. This means it's also probably less expensive. You take power away from organized crime, blah, blah, blah. That's the generic stuff. Then I would say, look, but in the specific context of prostitution, it's even more important for us to legalize sex work for these reasons. And I just give this specific context about how, look, when you criminalize sex work, you punish already struggling, vulnerable women who are forced to sell their bodies in order to make a living, for example. You put them in jail, screw their lives up, there's a huge amount of stigma against it. But more importantly, you give the pimps a huge amount of power over these women because you're relying on them to protect you from the police. That results in a huge amount of sexual abuse. It means that women get cheated. It means they get blackmailed. It means that they're forced into assault. It means that you have extraordinary rates of sexually transmitted diseases, for example. And this is why legalizing is uniquely important in this particular instance, because the good we're trading is not just substandard marijuana, it's human lives and human bodies. You can be intimidated, terrified, beaten, and hurt. I hope that makes sense as to what I'm trying to achieve. I'm just trying to take a generic argument and be like, here's why it's even more powerful now that we've applied it to the specific context of legalizing sex work as opposed to just any trafficked good. Any questions? Great. So that actually concludes my presentation. This PowerPoint was very attractive because I ripped it off the internet. And because I ripped it off the internet, I have to show this credit slide before I end. I'm just here now if you guys have any questions at all about this presentation or in general. I have about 15 minutes left, so shoot any questions you like at me. If not, feel free to leave. Have a great